Today we're going to talk about service transition. Before we begin, we want to make clear what goes on during service transition. To illustrate what service transition is, we show the process of one service being replaced by another. In this example, the process of sending an envelope exemplifies an important business function. The stakeholders involved rely on this function because it provides business value. The service medium to perform this business function for the stakeholders, in this case, is USPS. A disruptive innovation is forced to change in this business function. USPS is no longer as efficient as this up-and-coming technology. Email. This new technology comes with inherent risks that must be managed. Some risks include that we don't know enough about the technology, that users must adapt and change, the technology might not be secure or may not be entirely reliable. Users must be trained how to use it. This business service includes a business function, which in this case is delivering information, the stakeholders, which are the people sending information and the people also receiving that information, and the service medium, or how the service is performed. And so you'll see in this example, we have someone writing the letter, preparing that information that needs to be sent, the sending of that letter, and the stakeholders involved. This, we see a transition here toward email, where the letter is prepared on a keyboard, the letter is sent via the internet, and the letter is received again on a computer or via that same transmission type. And so you should see throughout the remainder of this presentation that the business function and the stakeholders stay the same, but the service medium that we talk about, or how the service is performed, changes. Service transition is the effective transition from one service to another service. In effect, it is managing change, managing assets and configurations, and managing knowledge.
All right, so let's talk about some service transition best practices. This list could be, a lot longer, maybe a bit shorter, but these are some things that we thought are very integral to a successful service transition. So we begin with understanding customers and their business needs. Along with that, setting reasonable expectations. Before starting any project, it is really important to understand the needs and the business value that the change provides in order to correctly deliver the things that are needed. Be sure to set realistic expectations, but also be willing to say no when suggested tasks are outside of scope or require more resources than are available. Next up, we need to brainstorm, document, and take steps to reduce known errors. Really, we need to sit down and figure out a list of errors and current problems while also having a discovery session to understand what risks are involved in the transition. Some good examples of a risk are tight deadlines, the maturity level of the company or how equipped they are to handle the transition, data migration requirements, integration issues, as well as hardware and software incompatibility. Next up, now that we know what risks are out there, we need to find ways to minimize them and know how and when they might jeopardize a project. Next up, we could implement a change advisory board, which we'll talk a bit about later, but pretty much just helps in the decision-making process. Next up, we need to minimize performance variation. We need, our transition to do what we say it does. And do that most of the time. And lastly, we need proper training for intended use. We need to have the people that are going to be using this transition know how to use it and do so efficiently. So here we've got a change management model. And just real quick, going through that, we start by assessing the current situation and the business needs. After that, we design a solution. We implement that solution. We're going to make it happen. Game time. Manage the implementation. Make sure it doesn't go awry. And last of all, we need to continue to evaluate for further change and begin the process over again. Next up, the first main topic we'd like to talk about is change management. Some good things to know before starting. Communication is key. You need to have multiple people understanding really what we're working on and what we're trying to accomplish. We need to make sure the timing is right and that the resources are available. Within the company, you need to know, who is going to champion your cause, who actually is passionate about what we're doing, high up, as well as people who actually are going to be using the transition service. Moving on, we're going to assign leadership roles, going back to that change advisory board. Pretty much what a change advisory board does is that it gives support to a change management team by approving requested changes and assisting in assessment and prioritization of changes. A change manager is pretty much someone that's assisted by a group of people in making those decisions and scheduling them. Next up, you need to address workforce concerns. In doing this, we are able to manage, the morale of employees, how they feel about a certain transition, which in effect will make it much more successful. We need to regularly assess and review during the process. And, lastly, you need to give it time. Rome wasn't built in a day, and sometimes things don't start off great, but can make a great comeback.
All right, the next major player in service transition is knowledge management. Knowledge management goes hand in hand with change management. It's the gathering, storing, and sharing of relevant knowledge regarding IT services. In more simple terms, it's making sure the right person has the right knowledge at the right time in order to deliver the new service or support the new service. Let's give a short example using this pyramid here. Let's say this corporation, we'll call them Corp XYZ, is about to roll out a new IT procedure. In order to do so, utilizing proper knowledge management, they would start at the top and move down communicating the steps of the change and also communicating the value of the change. The steps and understanding would trickle down until it reached the enterprise as a whole. In this way, confusion is avoided and efficiency is improved by reducing the need to rediscover knowledge. Next up, we have release and deployment management. A great definition of this, though a little wordy, comes to us from BMC Digital Enterprise Management. They define risk and deployment management as follows: to plan, schedule, and control the build, test, and deployment of releases while protecting the integrity of existing services. The goal is really to create a detailed delivery schedule and plan to ensure that new releases are delivered at optimized speed with the least amount of risk and cost, as the slide says. Right now, I work in a corporation in which they employ release and deployment management by creating a test code base that directly mirrors live code base. They're able to deploy changes in the test environment to make sure everything works before moving to the live environment. This lowers risk and protects the integrity of the existing services. Ultimately, the goal is to avoid a situation like the one we see here in this meme. We don't want Bain in charge of our release and deployment.
The next piece of service transition is service validation and testing. Validation and testing ensures an acceptable level of risk is met. If a set amount of risk is surpassed, the service cannot be trusted and requires more implementation work. Once the service meets an acceptable level of risk, the service is tested for functionality, security, availability, continuity, and regression tested.
Finally, we want to talk about change evaluation. As we talked about earlier, evaluation should occur throughout the process. It should constantly be asked the question, what is this adding to our corporation? How is this helping? The goal of change evaluation is to assess major changes, like the introduction of a new service or a substantial change to an existing service, before those changes are allowed to proceed to the next phase of their life cycle. It's really important to note that we should evaluate all changes, not just the major ones. But for significant changes, a formal evaluation process should be invoked. Each organization should define for itself what a significant change is, because it's going to be different for every organization. These evaluations should include evaluating the intended effects of the change and analyzing what exactly is going to happen before it's implemented. As far as possible, you should also try to anticipate any unintended effects that the change is going to have, that the change is going to incur. Also, you need to identify risks, things that this change will affect within your company. Lastly, you need to present a recommendation to change management on whether to proceed to the next stage. This is where decisions are reached on whether to continue with the service base and its contributed business value. We want to wrap up by saying that service transition is obviously a step in the larger ITIL life cycle. The next step being service operations and other operational activities. It's important to note that service transition is there to help us in the daily operations of our business. Without the right prep, the transition is not as effective. So the key is efficiency. We should continually try to be as efficient as possible in our changes. Finally, that's all, folks.